Morning, everyone. I'm Kim Knox, Program Chair with the League of Women Voters of San Diego. Thank you for joining us for Hot Topic Saturday. Now I'd like to introduce LWV San Diego President, Lori Thiel.
Hi, everybody. Happy Saturday. Thank you for joining us today and taking time out of your day to educate yourself a little bit about Prop 21. I know it's kind of early in the voting season, the election cycle, but it's always good to kind of get some information under our belt. So I'm glad that you are here with us today and you're planning on participating in this event. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes before we get started to give you some idea about some other opportunities you're going to have with the League. I invite you to visit our website. It's lwvsandiego.org. And once there, you will see on our landing page and on other pages, there are opportunities to participate with us and engage in voter outreach and voter information opportunities. So you'll see our committee meetings listed there, not only on our landing page, but on our calendar. But you'll also see that we are hosting or moderating candidate forums. So if you want to take a look, you can see opportunities to attend those. We also provide prop talks, which is essentially a ballot review on request. Those reviews are essentially requests by organizations around San Diego to come to their members and provide ballot reviews on the propositions and measures that are going to be on the ballots in November. So we also have training sessions. We have a voter registration training, for example, on the 17th of this month. And we have other opportunities like this one where we host webinars and provide information for you. So if you will look at that calendar on lwvsandiego.org, which I believe Kim has put in the chat, well, maybe perhaps you can do that after this event today, but you'll see that we're hosting another webinar on the 23rd about race and civil rights. That one will discuss Props 16, 17, and 18. So you can get a sense of what those are about and what you'll be voting for on those. And then on the next live webinar we do will be entitled Fair and Impartial Courts, How We Evaluate Judges on the Ballot. And that will be, our panelists that day will be Honorable Judith McConnell and a professor from the University of San Diego School of Law, Professor Virginia Nelson. So we invite you to go to our website and register for those events and join us on those. So let's go ahead and get started with today's event. I'm going to turn it back over to Kim and we can get started with the introduction of the speakers and the content of today. Thanks.
Thanks, Lori. We have two speakers today. Susan Hunter will explain why she thinks we should vote for Prop 21, and Alan Nevin will recommend a no vote. After that, we'll ask the speakers to answer questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen to submit questions. Now, our first speaker. With over 10 years of tenant advocacy under her belt, Susan Hunter is now a housing justice organizer with the Yes on Prop 21 campaign. As a tenant organizer for Housing Human Right and the Los Angeles Tenants Union, she incorporates her work in the trenches into current policy that needs to be changed to help our working class families find more stability. Go ahead, Susan.
Good morning, and thank you so much for your time today. I greatly appreciate it. We do have a slideshow. Are we able to? Oh yeah, there we go. So while that is loading, I just want to open up and saying, we do need to do more for our working class families in California. And that's something that even the state has acknowledged, that our tenants and our working class families, they're paying too much in rent, which is why the state got the ball rolling with an anti-rent gouging measure, which was a great first step, but it was only meant to put a foot in the door of the issue. There's a lot of drawbacks to what we have currently, especially the main one being that it expires in 10 years. David Hsu, who authored the bill, even acknowledged that it didn't do enough. And that's why he's actually endorsed Prop 21, because the idea being we want to be able to dovetail what the state is doing into local control. So then that way we can do more locally to protect our working class families, because it's not enough just to keep families with a roof over their head. We need to be able to enable them to move into home ownership. And currently, too many of our working class families are not able to do that because they are paying out so much in rent. So that's what Prop 21 does. It really gives families the breathing room that they need to be able to financially save a down payment on a home and move into home ownership. They can become a stronger part of your community. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what I like to do, I like to start off the presentations, and I know we don't have all the time in the world, but I do like to start off the presentations by giving a brief overview of the three main buckets of Prop 21. So that way, anybody who's not really familiar with it will have a chance to get more information. If you have already researched it, then this can kind of confirm what you've already learned about Prop 21. So to give the basic overview, there's three main components that I like to break it down into on Prop 21. The first bucket is that we want to be able to update the rent control laws that we already have in the state of California, which are wildly outdated. We want to be able to allow local governments much more control in being able to either expand the rent control that they have or to be able to instill new rent control and being able to move the needle up on the types of properties and the year of the property that would be able to be subject to any kind of local rent restriction ordinances. Currently, right now, the law says you cannot apply any kind of rent restriction to a building that's from 1995 or newer. So apparently, buildings that were built in the time when Clinton was in administration are still considered so brand new that they have to recoup their construction costs. We're saying that that's not working anymore. We can't have a fixed date. We need to be able to have more maneuverability. So we want to be able to open that up. So we're aiming for 15 years. So once a building hits a 16th year of construction, once it's been around for 16 years, it's old enough to drive, it should be able to be subject to a local rent control ordinance. And we chose 16 years because we did want to make sure that housing providers were able to recoup their construction costs on brand new construction without tampering with the market. So we heard those concerns, we built it in. We gave a 15-year head start, which is very generous, it's very fair, pencils out very well. But we also do want to be able to make sure that we're adding to our rent control stock every year. So then that way we can protect more of our working class families. If we can go to the next slide, please. The second bucket is that we want to be able to protect more types of renters. Currently under state law, we are only allowed to have any kind of rental restriction on multifamily units, which is what we typically call apartment buildings. Anything that's a condominium or a single family home cannot be protected by any kind of rent restriction. And the reason why this is an issue is because we look at the corporate landlords, groups like Blackstone and Invitation Homes, that after the 2008 market crash, built a huge portfolio by going and purchasing properties that had been bankrupted and then re-renting it back to the same families that were living in it at a higher rental charge than what their mortgage had been. And the reason why they were able to do this is because we don't allow for any kind of rental restrictions on single family homes, which is exactly why they targeted single family homes. So we're saying we have to be able to expand this out. We did also want to do an automatic carve out for homeowners that have a second home as a rental property. So when we look statewide at what we consider organic natural property owners, the small property owners statewide, the overwhelming majority, almost 70% statewide, have a single family home that they live out of, and then they have a second single family home that they rent out as either vacation property or as a secondary source of income with a long-term tenant in it. If you fall into that category, you get the automatic exemption. And I want to be very clear, Prop 21 doesn't say that's the only exemption that you're allowed. You are allowed in your locality to have further exemptions, but these are the people that get the automatic pass. And the reason, the other, more nuanced subsection of this part though, the condition is that you have to be what's considered a natural owner. It can't be behind an LLC. So if your property is not registered under an LLC, if you're a natural owner, the tenant knows who you are and you have conversations, you would be exempted, because that's the kind of business relationship in property ownership that we want to encourage and foster. We want to make sure that there's a natural ownership, that the tenant knows who you are and that they can have communications. And what we're trying to push back against is this, and to not reward, is this LLC abuse that we're seeing happening statewide. So currently, there are a lot of properties that are being registered under LLCs, and the reason that becomes an issue because once a property is registered as under an LLC, that property is in actuality its own owner. It is a small property because it owns itself and it owns only itself. So if we were allowing it to open up to LLCs, everybody would be considered a small property owner, including groups like Blackstone and Invitation Homes. So we're saying we can't continue to reward this bad behavior. It becomes a problem when you are trying to contact a property owner because there's an issue. I had a situation with tenants where we finally tracked down the owner. We had to go through so many multiple layers of LLCs. We ended up rerouting through the Cayman Islands to a conglomerate in Amsterdam before we finally figured out who the property owner was. And that's absurd. So we're saying enough is enough. We can't continue to have to go through this, this peel back of multiple LLCs to get to an individual. So we wanna make sure we're rewarding the actual property owners in the state of California who have a natural ownership, and saying you should absolutely get an automatic exemption if you have the 1-for-1, which is the overwhelming majority of people, the small property owners in the state of California. If we can go to the next slide, please. And this is the third bucket. So we also want to be able to permit moderate vacancy control. What that means is that we want your locality to be able to limit the amount of increases between two tenancies. I want to be very clear about this. Vacancy control has nothing to do with a tenant who is in a tenancy. If you are a tenant and you're in your rental, this has nothing to do with determining how much your rent increases would go up. That is something that your locality would have to make that decision. We, as Prop 21, do not automatically instill rent control anywhere. Be very clear about that. We do not instill rent control anywhere. We are not saying that your rent's going to go up any certain percentage. Your community needs to decide what that percentage level is going to look like. What we do have a problem with is the target on the backs of our seniors and our fixed income tenants. There's a lot of pressure under greedy landlords who want to get them out to get a higher rent paying tenant in. So if you were an older tenant, if you've been in a rent controlled tenancy for a long time, you're paying below market rate. And unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is a push to get those tenants out. And typically what happens when those tenants are out is that they're pushed into the streets or into homelessness. And that's not something that we can continue to allow. We can't sit by and watch an increase in our seniors becoming displaced into homelessness and not do something about it. So what we want to do is we want to take away that financial incentivizing, pushing out our fixed income tenants. And the way to do that is to allow, again, for moderate vacancy control. We've had vacancy control before in the state of California. The cities were wildly successful with it. And it wasn't until we had a state law come through that took it away that we saw this unregulation of markets really become the problem that we're seeing today, where we have a flow of people who are already barely making it, losing their housing and becoming displaced. So we want to remove that target off those backs of our fixed income tenants. We've also heard concerns as far as how this would work. So the best way that we've found to make sure it's a level playing field for as many people as possible is that if you have a tenancy of 3 years or less, when that tenant decides to vacate, when they decide to leave, move of their own accord, the incoming tenant, the difference in rent from what you were charging the old tenant to the new tenant would be whatever the allowable rent increases for your area that you all have decided for that year. So let's just assume for math's sakes it was 5% fixed rent increase every year, 5%. So the new tenancy would be 5%. And the reason why is because if you had a tenant who was there for 3 years or less, you're already at the higher end of the market. You're already close towards that market level. And you've already had the allowable rent increases while that tenant was in that unit. And then you're going to have the rent increases that are allowable for the next tenant while they're in their unit. So every year that rent is going to be going up a certain percentage so that you're not falling behind in being able to cover costs for repairs, maintenance, insurance, and taxes. If you've had a tenant who was there for longer than 3 years, and keep in mind the average tenancy being 5 years, if you've had that tenant who was in there for 3 years or more, you're going to be able to tack on an additional 15%. So if you had a tenant who was there for 4 years, they moved out, you're going to be able to raise that rent 20% in the difference. So we want to make sure that if you did have an older tenant, that you're able to apply more money into the unit to make it more competitive on the market. And that's where that 15% once off comes in. So anything after 3 years, you'll get an additional 15% bonus. If it's below the 3 years, you're already close to the market, then you're going to be doing just the regular, whatever the percentage is that's allowed by your community for that year. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we want to talk about why do we need this? So I pulled some really interesting information, specifically in San Diego. Why do we have to address this situation? Because we have too many of our working class families in the state of California that are burdened being able to pay their rent, and they are one paycheck away from ending up in a car in the street. And when we look at San Diego, it's very apparent. I pulled this data from the California Office of Environmental Health and Hazard. This is unfortunately the most recent data that they have is 2017, but as you can see, in San Diego, you have a large amount of the population that's already financially burdened because their income is not high enough, and then their rent on top of it being too high, they are extremely rent burdened. Meaning they're having a very hard time keeping that roof over their head. Statewide, when you look across the state of California, half of our renter families are paying out more than 30% of their income, which is considered rent burden. You shouldn't be paying out more than 30%. That's too much, because we want to make sure that we're able to invest money back into our local economies. Of the half of our renter families that are paying out more than 30%, of them, 25% entire state of California are paying out more than half or more of their income on rent, which is crazy that they're paying out 50% or up to 75% or more of their income on rent, a quarter of the population of renters in the state of California. These are our working class families. These are the people that make sure that we keep going as a state. These are nurses, these are janitors, these are our teachers. These are the people that we really need to make sure have some stability, so in that way, community-wise, we also have stability. So we have to be very mindful of the fact that we're not just talking about how much rent they're paying, we also have to talk about their income and how that's affecting overall the situation. We can go to the next slide, please. So when we look at more specific data, when we're talking about San Diego, we have to look at the cost of renting as outpacing the increase in minimum wage in San Diego. And there's a reason why I like to use minimum wage as kind of the basis to understand where we're actually at. So right now, this year in San Diego, the minimum wage is $13 an hour. It's matching with the state. When you're looking at the data for rentals in your area, the cost monthly of a one bedroom on average is $2,237. Well, at $13 an hour, your minimum wage a month before taxes on a 40-hour work week is equal to $2,080. So the rents are already higher than what you're earning on minimum wage. And the reason why I like to really kind of target in and focus on what's happening on the lower end on the minimum wage earners, when you look at your minimum wage earners, and the reason why San Diego instilled a minimum wage program back in 2012, almost 40% of workers in the city were making minimum wage or equivalent. 40% of the wage earners in the city. That's a huge amount of people. So these are the people that are really at that end, that tipping point of being one paycheck away from falling into homelessness. The other thing was that there are slightly more women than men who are in the low wage workforce. So this is really impacting women too, especially on the lower end of the scale of being able to earn enough money to be able to afford what is actually more than their earnings, more than 100% of their earnings, to be able to pay for a one bedroom apartment on average. And I also like to point out, when you look at that graph on the side, the average rent in San Diego from Rent Cafe, if you look at the very bottom section, it's also telling you how the majority of the rental units are in the $1,000 or more range. You only have about, I think it's 8% that are below $1,000. So it's a very small percentage, it's less than 10% of your entire housing stock that is below $1,000 in a rental, for a rental charge. So that is something that we're going to be talking about later, but I just want to make sure I point that out for when we do have that conversation for later on. If we can go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about what happens to people who are paying out more than what they can afford in rent, we're talking about a pipeline into homelessness. I pulled your homeless count from 2020 for the city of San Diego. And if you look at two really important graphs that came out of that homeless count information, about halfway down on the left-hand side, the city of San Diego graph, you'll see that women make up 25% of your entire homeless population. A quarter of your homeless population are women, which is huge. If you look to the graph on the right, the origin of homelessness, nearly 80% of your homeless are from within San Diego. And these are not people that are what we consider to be chronic. Chronically homeless means that they've been homeless for 2 years or more. So these were people that were housed less than 2 years ago in the city of San Diego, and a quarter of them were women, and they are now homeless. And there's a direct pipeline in between people who are rent burdened and who missed that one paycheck, who missed that one rental date, who fall below too short, and they end up in a situation where they're living in a car on the streets. And that's what we have to address. So when we're also looking at nationwide, among industrial nations, the US has the largest number of homeless women and the highest number on record since the Great Depression. Since the Great Depression, we have not been able to get our homeless number of women down to be anywhere competitive with any of the other industrialized nations in the globe. So this continues to be a problem, and one that we have not properly addressed for a very long time. We can go to the next slide, please. So what happens when we have an increase in homelessness, especially recently homeless from that area? And the reason why people who are homeless from within an area stay in an area, because just because they're homeless doesn't mean they don't have jobs. Doesn't mean that they don't have kids who are in school. It's where your services are. If you've been paying out your unemployment taxes off of your income, you need to stay within that state in order to be able to get that money for disability or for unemployment, unless you're in a voucher system. So what happens is when we have an increase in homelessness and people have to stay in the area, we're also seeing that we're having to push property taxes to pay for the services that those people need. So these people who were housed, that did have a roof over their head, that now need to transition into homeless housing and homeless services, the rest of the community has to pick up the tab. And it doesn't make sense to me, and it is not fair in my viewpoint, that a small percentage of the population are wanting to be able to maximize profits by displacing people into homelessness to move in higher rent paying tenants, and the rest of the community has to pick up the tab for those services through your increase in property taxes. So we do want to be able to make sure that we're not continuing to increase property taxes by being able to have more local control to address this situation. If we can go to the next slide, please. That's where we'll be wrapping up very shortly. Overall, what this has meant nationwide, we're seeing that home ownership rates are falling. So if you're not able to barely keep a roof over your head, the other problem is you're not able to save up a down payment on a home. So we're seeing nationwide a decline in home ownership. We want to be able to transition people out of rentership into home ownership. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that as well as we should. That is really impacting single parents, which typically falls to be a single mother. That's really impacting especially women of color and people of color, and especially in the 30 to 34 age range. So we do want to really be able to transition single parents in this age range, especially women of color, into home ownership. And right now, they're just not able to do it. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what you'll hear a lot about is that we already have statewide rent control, and I want to address this. We do not have statewide rent control. What we had was AB 1482, which was a great first step. But even the author of the bill, David Chu, has said it is not rent control, it is anti-rent gouging. It still caps rent increases statewide at no more than 10%, which is massive. Imagine your mortgage going up 10% every year. It is more than what the income is in an area. In most areas of people, especially minimum wage earners, their incomes are not going up 10% every year. So 10% is too high to begin with. The other issue with 1482 is that it expires in 10 years. And the idea being that in this 10-year time period, we are supposed to be working on repealing the state laws and reforming the state laws, so that way we can enact broader local rent control, so that when 1482 expires, the areas that have it and need it will have formed some sort of local rent control ordinance. And that way we can do more for our working class families. It was an anti-rent gouging bill. We do not have state rent control. I want to be very clear about that. Nowhere is there a rental bill that says we have rent control statewide. We're just saying that we're capping the rent increases at no more than 10%, which is pretty massive. That's a big rent hike. We can go next slide, please. So just to close, AB 1482, that was a great first step, but we need to keep moving forward to do more for our working class families. And Prop 21 is that next step. We need to expand rental protection statewide so that our working class families aren't just surviving, but we want them to be able to thrive We need to make sure that they can actually spend less of their income on rent so that they can save money to become the next homeowners in our community. And right now, they're not able to do that. We need to stop the increase of property taxes to pay for homeless services for people who had a roof over their head, but lost it just because they couldn't afford the rent. The community should not have to pick up that tab so that a few more are able to make more profits. Prop 21, to be very clear, does not institute rent control. What it does is it's removing the barriers so that local communities can determine if they want rent control and to what level and who it will exempt. So Prop 21 is the answer communities need to be able to have more local control, to stop that increase of homelessness, to be able to protect small property owners from the corporate giants who claim to be small players, and to make sure property owners aren't seeing an increase in property taxes. So Prop 21, we're really trying to push to cut off that LLC loophole abuse by automatically exempting natural property owners who own the 2 properties or less, and allowing for localities to decide if they want to exempt more. This also means that since we'll be running less LLCs through the state of Delaware, hopefully, because we're rewarding the idea of being a natural property owner, we're going to have more of those business tax dollars coming back to our state and not places like Delaware. And that really burns my butter. We also want to make sure that we're putting controls on the market to slow it down, because right now it is out of control. We want to make sure that rent increases more closely match wage increases, while allowing for a fair return on investment properties, with that 15% increase on vacancy rates for the tenancies of 3 years or more. And in San Diego, 92% of your housing stock, that's what we pointed out earlier, it's above $1,500 to $2,000 a month, which means that as we're slowing down the increases on the newer units, the older units, by adding that 15% to their vacancy rate plus what is allowed for that area, will be able to catch up in not that many tenancies. So as we're leveling out that market, it is going to take a little bit of time, but depending on where you're at, between 2 to 5 tenancies, you are going to be slowing it down so that it's much more even across the board, making it easier on landlords and tenants to be able to budget for the future, because we want to slow down those fluctuations. Everybody seems to really focus on the high end of when we're saying, well, the market's doing really well. But when the market's not doing well, that's an extreme fluctuation down. We want to be able to balance that out for both the property owners and the tenancies. And one example is what's happening right now with COVID. We are seeing the high end of the market come down. So instead of trying to say that we need to be able to expand faster, what we're seeing is a natural end, the end of the market slowing down. And as the older properties, of which you have less than 10%, are coming up, the middle part's already averaging out. So we want to make sure that we can encapsulate that and slow it down so we can benefit from what's happening right now in the long term for the small property owners and the tenants. That's my time. Our website is yeson21ca.org. That's yeson21ca.org if you'd like to sign up, get more information, look at the language about measure yourself, send any questions, tell me if I did a terrible job. I hope not. And again, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate it.
All right, thank you for that information, Susan. Next, we'll hear from Alan Nevin, Director of Market Research and Valuations at Xpera Group. He holds a master's degree in statistics and research from Stanford and has an extensive background in real estate economics, lending, and market analysis. He is the co-founder of firms that bought, built, rehabbed, and operated more than 36 residential and commercial projects in San Diego County. Alan, go ahead, and I'll get your slides up in just a moment.
Great. Good morning. In April, in the US, the unemployment rate was up to almost 15%. It has dropped almost in half. We're down to 8.4%. And what I like to point out, being an optimist, is that 91.6% of the folks are still working. And that, not as high as I'd like to see it, but it's also not a complete tragedy. Let's look at the next one. One of the things that we always look at, because it comes out every week, is the statistics on initial unemployment claims. And they have been dropping very, very dramatically from March, the last week in March, which was the high point for unemployment claims. And since then, they've gone down almost 90%. So that's good news. On the next slide, we show unemployment by years of educational attainment, and I find this rather fascinating. Those with a bachelor's degree or higher, the unemployment rate is at 6.7%. And if you have less than a high school degree, it's more than twice that, almost 3 times that. So it's really a matter of the bachelor degree holders or higher are in industries that have done much better, have maintained stability compared to those other industries which typically hire folks with lesser degrees or no degrees. Let's look at the next. I just wanted to point this out, that the unemployment rate for married men and women tend to be much lower than the unemployment rate for non-marrieds. Just a tidbit for you. Let's look at the next one. Now, here in San Diego County, we see that almost half of the job losses in March and April were in leisure and hospitality. And in the May through July period, 60%. So it's been a real tragedy for leisure and hospitality in the county. And of course, that is the industry that has traditionally had the highest percentage of the lower income workers. So from that standpoint, it has been a terrible experience. When you look down the line and you look at professional and business services, there's basically been hardly any losses there. And the last couple of months, the jobs have really come back as they have for educational and health services and the like. So it's a situation where the leisure and hospitality continue to suffer. And, you know, we're a county that relies very heavily on our leisure and hospitality to fill our jobs. And when we look at what's happened with conventions and the cruise ship business and generally the restaurant business, that's really been the big hurt. And hopefully the figures for when they come in for August and September, we'll see some improvement in leisure and hospitality as more and more restaurants open. I will tell you that the hotels that are located in the coastal region have been doing very well the last 2 or 3 months as the summer business has materialized, because we have about 25 million people that live within an easy one-day drive of San Diego, and it's natural for them to vacation rather than taking a plane somewhere else. So the business has generally been rather good in leisure and hospitality near the coast. Let's see the next one. Let's look at construction. And I think it really feeds well into a discussion of Prop 21. We are not producing anywhere near as many housing units as we should, given the increase in our population in San Diego County. We should be producing about 13, maybe 15,000 units a year. And we haven't done that since before the Great Recession. Obviously, between 2008 and 2011, our production was negligible. It started going back up again around 12, but you can see that we had a fairly good burst in 2016 and 17, and it's gradually been going downhill since then. So we're building up a shortage that is very realistic. And we are not having a shortage of high-priced homes or high-priced apartments. Our great need is to have lower-priced housing and lower-priced apartments. It's sort of interesting that for the last 30 years, we have maintained 55% ownership and 45% rental. Hasn't changed for 30 years. And the big problem tends to be that we cannot produce, we being the development industry, we cannot produce moderate priced housing. You can do it in Vegas, Phoenix, Texas, Florida, can't do it here. And the reason is the land prices are very, very high, and the ability to produce housing has been greatly hindered by numerous local ordinances that have driven up the price of land. And it can take sometimes 3 years, 5 years, 10 years to get a project approved. And that drives up the price of housing. Let's look at the next slide. And then the next one. One of the things that we're seeing, and it's sort of interesting, ignoring the fact that COVID has been around since March, the number of homes being sold has been really quite good. The July and August were gangbuster months for housing, because the demand for sale housing continues to accelerate as interest rates go down. Because if you can get today actually, you can get a 15-year fixed rate mortgage for 2.5% to 2.75%. So you have an enormous number of people who have been waiting and could afford a home if the interest rates came down. It has come down, and the home sales have just been terrific, both in the new and the resale market. Let's look at the next one. The closed sales, it's really interesting, because even with COVID, we have a situation where the year 2020 sales through August have just been about the same as last year without COVID. On the next slide, I want to show you a couple of indicators. You know, typically, buyers will negotiate from the list price. That's not happening anymore. We're seeing that buyers are paying virtually 100% of list price. The days on market has dropped precipitously. They've dropped in half. And months supply of inventory, in other words, the number of homes that are on the market in most metropolitan areas in normal times, there's a 6-month supply of inventory. Here we're down to 1.3 months on single family and 1.7 on attached units, condos, townhouses. And the problem, once again, is the inventory isn't there. People are not putting up their homes for sale right now, and that's causing a major crunch in the market and is starting to drive up prices, which certainly doesn't help affordability issues. Let's look at the next one. This will become as no surprise to you that single-family homes under $500,000 are rather quickly disappearing from the market. There's a slight typo here. in the second column, it should be August 19, because in the last year, the number of homes that have sold for under $500,000 has plummeted down 1/3. And even the attached homes under $500,000 have gone down somewhat. So we have this critical housing shortage that won't go away, and frankly, won't go away for a long, long time, because we just can't produce enough housing. I assure you, it's not home builders who are holding product back from going onto the market. They cannot produce enough housing. So what happens, by the way, is that you have a rather large number of households who are forced to move to Riverside County and commute every day. There are 60-some thousand cars on the Highway 15 every morning that are coming down here because they can't afford to buy there. We also have more than 20,000 people a year, American citizens, who come across the border and live in Mexico because they just can't afford to live here. Let's look at the next. Let's look at apartment rents in the county. Contrary to what everyone talks about in terms of high rents, over the last 4 years, the average increase in rents have gone up 3.1%. I will also tell you that expenses have gone up more than 3.1% for a number of factors. But the reality is that even though the rent control ordinance that's in place today allows increases of 5% plus inflation, give or take 2%, theoretically, rents could be increased by 7% a year. That's not happening. And frankly, it's not happening because people are resisting rent increases. They really can't afford the kind of rents we have. But it has nothing to do with greedy landlords. It has to do with the fact that we have a severe housing shortage and that expenses continue to go up. And apartment owners, most of whom are mom and pops in this county, basically are stuck in a vice that they just can't get around. They are in a situation where they really don't like to raise rents. Believe it or not, they would rather have 100% occupancy, a stable occupancy, very low turnover. And when you look at most of the apartment projects in the county, they are mom and pop owned. If you look at the apartment association's rent survey that just came out, and it's online, you can see that most of the apartment projects are mom and pop owned, and that they really have not been able to generate higher rents. Let's go forward. Now let's talk about rent control. First of all, in 2019, we voted against Prop 10 because folks understand rent control doesn't work. Prop 10 lost by 20%. That's pretty convincing. So we already have this rent control ordinance in effect that, as I mentioned earlier, allows increases up to 5% annually, plus the rate of inflation. That hasn't happened. They haven't been able to raise rents like that. They don't want to raise rents like that. The current Rent Control Act is in place until 2030. So we've got 10 more years where we have this maximum rent increase of 5% plus inflation. And incidentally, it's my belief that inflation will stay low for an indefinite period of time. So Californians basically are intelligent enough to know that rent control has never worked and never will. Let's look at the next slide. Now, we have an act in effect in California called the Costa-Hawkins Act. And it was put into effect quarter century ago, and it protects many properties from rent control. It says if it's been built since 1995, that's exempt. And it also exempts single-family homes and condominiums, and it does allow property owners to reset a unit's rent to market rate after a tenant has vacated a rent-controlled unit. So there is a form of rent control in effect, and it works pretty well. Let's look at the next slide and talk about Prop 21. It allows a 15% increase in the first year when the market reality is 3 to 4%. I mean, it's sort of interesting. It's basically telling owners that they can increase the rents all they want to in the first year. Well, the reality, of course, they really can't because everybody would move out. 15% is totally obnoxious. Now, it says a tenant vacates a unit, rent can be raised 15%, even if the tenant has lived in the home or apartment for decades, or if the landlord substantially remodels the apartment or home. It's sort of interesting. I have a number of friends who own apartment units that have tenants in there who've been there 15 and 20 years, and their rents are way below market. Now, if that tenant vacates and the rent can only be raised 15%, there's a good chance that that 15% is really much lower than market. So they are being penalized because you can only raise it 15%. Now, the courts have continually ruled that landlords must be allowed to increase rents enough to receive some profit each year. And that holds true throughout the state, and it only seems reasonable. It actually hasn't been tested very much, I will say that. Now, under Prop 21, that allows every city to apply its own rent control laws. And that is a disaster, because what it will do is cause a major disruption in the financial markets, because they will not have a reliable basis, lenders won't, for making loans on homes and apartments in California. And that will have the effect of reducing the value of properties, will make them far less attractive to the investor market. And if property values go down because of Prop 21, that means that cities and school districts will have a decline in property tax revenue, which is not something that they would look forward to. So Prop 21 is pretty much of a disaster. And I think that sort of tells my story.
All right, thank you, Alan. Now I'm going to put in the chat the website address for Voters Edge. This is a website that has information about everything that will be on your ballot, candidates and measures. League of Women Voters volunteers help get that information, or help the candidates input their own information. And also information is gathered from the Secretary of State and the Registrar of Voters, and they include newspaper articles and all kinds of information about who's contributing to campaigns. So I want to go ahead and share that with you just briefly before we get to our Q&A. Okay, so I've typed in the address of the League of Women Voters of San Diego office. I'm going to click on Find My Ballot. So this is bringing up District 52 for Congressman, 39 for Senate. I'm going to go over to the tab for measures. And then you can see all the state propositions are here, 14 through 25. And then the city measures are below. I'm going to click on the Prop 21 rent control. So you can see here how it provides the information to help voters make an informed decision. So it tells about the way things are now, what if it passes, and what the effect of the budget is. Then we've got two columns here. People for this measure say these two things. People against say these things. You can go on to read in more detail. And then it makes it real simple right here. A yes vote means state law would allow cities and counties to apply more kinds of rent control to more properties than under current law. A no vote means state law would maintain current limits on rent control laws cities and counties can apply. So down below here, you've got links to the actual Secretary of State website where the ballot measure stuff is, and then you've got your published arguments for and against. And then you can see who supports or opposes the measure. So you've got a list of organizations here and a list here. Or you can look at the elected and appointed officials who are supporting or opposing. We've also got information on contributions. So you can see these organizations here gave these amounts of money, and there's other companies and organizations that have contributed on the no side. So tons of helpful information here. You've also got voting information. So I definitely recommend checking that out. So now I'll ask Lori.
Would you give us the name of that website again?
Yes. So I'm putting that in the chat. It's votersedge.org.
Thank you.
So during Susan's presentation, Susan, you mentioned the nuances and the sophisticated arrangement that LLCs provide property owners. And since there are two questions in our Q&A that allude to that a little bit, would you mind just clarifying that and maybe providing a little bit more information about that particular aspect of property ownership as it relates to LLCs? And then we'll go to the two questions that seem to relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're seeing statewide is what I consider to be an LLC abuse, where property owners, small or big, are running each individual property under its own LLC. So when you do an LLC search, you'll see things like 1524 Northway. So 1524 Northway LLC becomes its own LLC, meaning that that property is a small property. It is managed by somebody else, and the manager could own, manage thousands of properties. But that property itself under that LLC would automatically qualify as being a small property. So that's what we're saying is the issue of where we see the larger corporations abusing LLCs and trying to also claim to be a small property owner. And that's why we have to address the situation that's going on. When I look at, I didn't pull the stats specifically for San Diego. I know for a fact though, in Hollywood, where I live in Los Angeles, in my neighborhood of just this one zip code of 90028, of the LLCs, of all the LLCs in my neighborhood, 60% are run through Delaware. So 60% of the LLC registered in my community, the business tax for running that LLC goes to a different state. It's not going to our schools. It's not going back here into my community. And that's a problem. So what we want to reward is that natural ownership by saying, look, if you're a natural owner and you have the one property that you own and live out of, and then you have the second one that you own and rent out, and there's no LLC involved, you get that automatic exemption, because we want to reward the good behavior and stop this bad LLC abuse that's happening throughout our state. So I hope, did that help to clarify what I was saying earlier?
It did, yes. And it leads right into the next question regarding natural owners. So I believe that you both gave different information on the percentage of natural owners in San Diego. So can you both just clarify the percentage of San Diego rentals owned by natural owners? Do you
I
have
don't
that?
have that information.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't.
Nor
I
do
didn't actually
I.
pull.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that would be kind of hard data because you'd have to go through the state to find out how many properties are actually listed under ownership for rental, and then you have to compare how many are run through LLC, and then whatever's left over, that would be your amount that you could kind of consider to be a natural ownership. So it would take some time for me to pull that data.
Okay, thanks. And then let me just ask the one more question that's a little bit or slightly related, and then Kim, you can take a couple of questions for them. So the other question that's perhaps related is, if you own a duplex and have a property manager that doesn't communicate directly with the owner, how does Prop 21 affect that?
So Prop 21 isn't that nuanced.
Okay.
I want to be very clear that what we're doing is we're setting up to be able to reward the good behavior of being a natural owner. It doesn't dictate based on if you use a property management company or not. In my own personal experience of having done tenant advocacy, I would say you have to be very careful. There are a lot of good property management companies out there, but there are some really bad apples. We had a situation where it was really bad as far as not doing repair work. And we finally tracked down the owner and notified them, and they had no idea. So Prop 21 isn't that nuanced to say that there's a differentiation between if you use a property management company or not. But on a personal note, I would say you have to be very careful to not be so hands-off and leave it all in somebody else's care. Please make sure that you're checking in, because you could be hearing one thing from the property management, but the tenants don't know how to get a hold of you if there's a major problem. So you're the one who's going to be left with the fines if there's a major problem. So it helps to check in and be involved.
Great. Okay. Kim, do you want to take a question?
Yeah, so what stops local municipalities from imposing rent controls now?
Did you want me to answer that, or yeah? Do you have,
Alan, do you have?
The current act that's in effect supersedes local control on that issue.
So that would be the Costa-Hawkins?
1482.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So
Thank you.
my answer would be that currently, and again, Prop 21 does not instill rent control anywhere. What we have is some allowances, but you are very restricted in your community in how far and how broad reaching your rent control would be allowed in your area. So there is a push from some of the tenant groups to want to be able to instill rent control. But right now, if they were to do it, you wouldn't be allowed to have any rent control in a building past 1995. So that means that people who are in properties in 1996 are still able to get those 8% rent increases. So you're still saying that people, just by the luck of the draw, whatever the age of their building, it doesn't matter their income, it doesn't matter what their current financial situation is, it's just the age of the building that would dictate how high their rent increases are. And that doesn't make sense to me. So if we're talking about we want to be able to protect more types of renters, then absolutely we should be able to be more broad. And since we're not going to be able to build our way out of it, we're going to have to use the current housing stock that we have to stabilize to make sure that we can provide the affordable housing we need for our working class families.
Thank you. One of the other questions we had was about revocable trusts. Are those treated the same as individual owners of single family homes?
So family trust is extremely nuanced, and that is something that would be entirely up to the locality to decide if they want to include that as a automatic pass or not.
Okay.
Do you want to ask the one about, well, I'll ask it. So there's another question regarding mobile home parks. And the question is specifically, how would changing the rules about rent control help stop the practices the mobile home parks use, which is apparently not allowing sales to anyone other than the park owners? Do either of you have any information on that?
I do. I don't know if Alan wants to answer.
No.
So interestingly enough, in the state of California, mobile homes actually have their kind of own Costa-Hawkins. So they actually have specific state laws that regulate mobile homes. We did include mobile homes as far as who would be protected under Prop 21, but there is still going to be some nuanced issues. So it really depends on the type of lease that you're setting up as you're getting into that mobile home ownership. And the reason why it's so nuanced, because in mobile homes, you're typically in a situation where you're getting into ownership of the mobile home itself, but you still have to rent the property and the land underneath of it. So it becomes a very complicated situation, but mobile homes typically where we find a lot of our seniors in affordable housing, and those are definitely targeted for development. So there has been a big push to eradicate a lot of the mobile home parks that we're seeing statewide. But one of the big hurdles is the fact that they do have their own state law. It's kind of their version of Costa-Hawkins. So that is something that we are looking into being able to reform that as well. So we do cover it, but there's only so much we can do.
You know, one of the things that we see here in Southern California is that it's almost impossible to develop a new mobile home park. And that's a form of housing that in lower priced areas maybe constitute 25 or 30% of all the owned units, but they can't be approved here. I'm talking politically speaking, and it would be very nice if we could, because that would be a marvelous form of home ownership if available.
Okay, we had someone asking about short-term rentals and homes that are purchased just for the purpose of vacation renting. People complain about them a lot when they don't provide on-site parking for the number of beds they advertise, and if they're not owner occupied, there are often complaints. So would this proposition have any effect on those?
So Proposition 21 does not address the use of a vacation property. I was involved in writing the home share ordinance, the short-term home share ordinance for the city of Los Angeles. And it is extremely frustrating trying to get something like this passed, because unfortunately, and when we talk about our housing market, we can't just talk about it as though it's in a bubble. There are a lot of other influences, including short-term rentals. So I do hope that the city of San Diego will be able to address it, but Prop 21 would not address short-term rentals, because that's a completely different type of use. When it comes to state law, you do have to stay within a certain scope. That's why we can't really have a silver bullet law like I would like, but if it's too broad, it's automatically denied. So we wouldn't be able to kind of regulate along with home sharing and rent control. However, if you look at the ordinance that was written in the city of LA, should San Diego decide that they want to replicate it, it does specifically say that you can't use rent controlled housing for short-term use. So that is a pathway that could be created if San Diego was to instill rent control and then expand upon it through that way.
I will say in the city of San Diego, that is a rather contentious situation where the city generates $30 million a year in transient occupancy tax, TOT, from short-term rentals. So they don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So that situation is long-term in terms of duration, and I'm not so sure what the city will actually do about it.
That's a good point. That has been an issue for a year or so now, or more, I believe. So let's see, do we have any other questions? We'll take a quick look. Okay, so it looks like we have addressed most of the questions from this webinar today. Susan and Alan, do you have any additional comments you'd like to make before we wrap up today?
Sure. Actually, I'll let Alan, did you want to go first? I can.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I feel like I've talked a lot, so I just make sure I'm not taking up more than my fair share. I just want to say, as we've kind of acknowledged on both sides, we can't rely on housing providers to provide what we actually need. I don't know that I agree with saying that they can't provide it. I think that there is a choice to choose profits over what we actually need in our area. I see time and time again where developers just refuse to even add a smidge extra of affordable housing, which I think means that that route is not going to work. And we have to look at what we have that's viable. And I think what we have is viable is looking at the housing stock we already have and leveling out that market and making sure that we create the affordable housing that we actually need without having to subsidize. I don't agree when I hear opposition say, what we need to do is create more subsidies, create a broader Section 8 package, I don't think that taxpayers should have to continue to pick up the tab for other people to make a small amount of profit. And I continue to believe that we absolutely need to enable our working class families to be able to move into home ownership. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that. And it was interesting to say that you're saying home ownership purchases are up, but I want to know who's buying them, because it's not our working class families. They're really COVID impacted. So we have to make sure that our communities are for our communities. We have to make sure that it's our interests that are involved in our communities and not special interests from corporate landlords and overseas developers and conglomerates. But right now, that's the pathway we're on. So Prop 21 is much more broad than just saying it's about rent control. It's about saying that we need to do more for our working class families in our communities. So I hope that you'll vote yes on 21 when you get your mail-in ballot. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. All right, Alan.
The real answer has to do with supply and demand, just that simple. And we as a county have done a terrible job in supplying homes and apartments. With the price of housing here, it is really very, very difficult for someone to buy a home or a condominium with an income much under $100,000 a year. But that's not the fault of the market. It's the fault of the fact that we don't have enough housing being built. So you have Prop 21, you have many other propositions in many other cities in the county that have tried to put a lid on rents. But if you can't put a lid on prices, you don't get to increase the percent of people who own a home. And it's very unfortunate. So the reality is that we need more supply. Nothing more will be helpful.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan and Susan, our panelists for today. I'd also like to thank Kim for pulling this all together and providing the tech support. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees who participated and provided really interesting questions and educated themselves on this proposition. So with that, I'd like to end this webinar and invite you all to go out and enjoy a spectacular and exciting Saturday in COVID land. So enjoy yourselves and have a good rest of your weekend. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.